Tonight on KQED Newsroom, 10 Democratic presidential candidates faced off in Atlanta this week as House Democrats try to bolster their case to impeach President Trump. Also, another month, another round of blackouts. PG&E cuts off power to customers in 11 counties amid dry and gusty weather conditions. And the 50th anniversary of the occupation of Alcatraz by American Indian activists. We'll hear about how the fight for indigenous rights reverberates today. Good evening and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Tiffany Kamhai. We begin tonight with the Democratic presidential debates. On Wednesday, 10 candidates faced off in Atlanta for a Democratic presidential debate. No one candidate broke out of the pack. Reflecting his surge in the polls, Pete Buttigieg came under fire for his political inexperience, while Kamala Harris tried to regain momentum. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, House Democrats heard from 9 witnesses this week in their impeachment investigation of President Trump. Ambassador Gordon Sondland and former White House advisor Fiona Hill were among those who testified. Sondland said there was, in fact, a quid pro quo for the release of military aid to Ukraine, while Fiona Hill characterized the pressure campaign as a, quote, domestic political errand. With us now is Guerra Foley, senior political writer for the San Francisco Chronicle and founder and president of She the People, Amy Allison. Thanks for being with us.
Good to be here.
Joe, let's start with you. Much has been made of South Bend, Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg and his recent rise in the polls, particularly in Iowa and New Hampshire. What was his goal on Wednesday night, and do you think he achieved it?
Well, his goal was for it not to be a Pete down, like everybody just beat on Pete Buttigieg because he's the poll leader. He's got bigger problems. He is ahead in a state that's 90% white, which is, that's nice. But when he comes to California, the stats here say that, half of Latinos don't even know who he is. So he's got some real problems. And when he goes to South Carolina, Amy, you spent a lot of time there, black folks are not into his campaign at all.
What's really amazing about Pete Buttigieg is that there is no path to victory in the primary without winning significant black support, particularly around black women. He's as close to zero as they come. And so I thought last night or this week was his opportunity to make his case in an authentic way to really appeal to black voters, particularly black women who are the powerhouse Democratic Party voters. And he was challenged on his racial justice record in South Bend. And I feel like he fell flat. And so he didn't gain momentum there. And therefore, I think as it relates to black voters, Buttigieg did not gain.
And he says, I asked him this at the California Democratic Party convention where I was at last week about this. And he said, no, I'm looking forward to making outreaches into the communities and Latinos and blacks. But he didn't even show up to the African American caucus at the California Democratic Party convention. So, there's a gap right now between the rhetoric and the reality for him.
Kamala Harris sure called him out on it on the stage.
And Amy, you were actually at the debate
I was right there.
Atlanta. What was the mood like there?
It's interesting because it's Tyler Perry's studios. It's Atlanta. This is a state that was electrified and literally transformed by the campaign of Stacey Abrams, who did the pre-show rally. It was the moment where I was sitting among people. It was very clear when we heard from the mayor of Atlanta and Stacey Abrams and Congressman Lewis, as well as Tom Perez, that Georgia is the middle of the battleground states. They're 1.4 points from being a blue state, and they recognize that not only do they have to deal with voter suppression, and we didn't hear enough about that on stage, about the reality of voter suppression in a state like Georgia, but they need to invest now in order to elevate turnout even more than we saw in record numbers for 2018. So there was a sense of people in the audience. They're really looking for signals from the candidates. Who is able to speak the language of a multiracial coalition? They can be a man or woman of any race, but are they going to appeal to people like in Georgia? And some did a very good job on that, and others fell on their face. And so that was a good measure of who's going to be positioned to reassemble the Obama coalition into 2020.
One of the most striking things for me in this debate was that this was the first debate where all four moderators were women. Amy and Joe, you can answer this also if you'd like to. Do you think that that affected the tenor of the debate and what was talked about?
I actually thought it was good. In the sense that child care was brought up. That's a universal, concern of parents in terms of being a burden, and there's not really a national solution to this. So we're able to really hear from the candidates much more deeply around an issue that affects a lot of us. And I think having women on the stage did make a difference in that way. I think the issue of abortion and choice was addressed more than before. But again, there were many, many more issues around. I think they talked about workplace harassment and the Me Too movement. And I thought that was really positive.
And they talked about housing too, which hasn't gotten a lot of play so far too, which is another issue that we had 4 or 5 debates, and it's the first time we've really had a discussion about housing.
It's interesting because if you look at women, particularly women of color, are going to be the swing vote in these battleground states for the battle of the White House, and they're also going to be the vote that ultimately decides who is a standard bearer for the Democratic Party. These issues matter. She the People just worked with Center for American Progress on a report that basically said, look, if you talk issues and issues that speak to the base, like some of the issues we were talking about, those are the things that excite people and get them to the polls. This is what needs to happen more and more in these debates that are coming up.
Well, California Senator Kamala Harris, she came out swinging at this debate. She's trying to revitalize her campaign. And there was one particularly testy exchange between her and Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard. Let's listen to that.
I think that it's unfortunate that we have someone on the stage who is attempting to be the Democratic nominee for President of the United States, who during the Obama administration spent 4 years full-time on Fox News criticizing President Obama.
That's
who
ridiculous,
has spent full-time.
That's ridiculous.
I'll give you a chance to respond.
What Senator Harris is doing is unfortunately continuing to traffic in lies and smears and innuendos because she cannot challenge the substance of the argument that I'm making, the leadership and the change that I'm seeking to bring.
Okay, Tulsi isn't polling that well. Why spend so much time attacking her?
First, can we say how amazing it was to have 2 women of color talking about foreign policy? It's kind of historic, and I kind of just want to appreciate that because we have the diversity on stage that allows for these kind of exchanges. I think the senator had to punch down on Tulsi Gabbard because
last time she didn't.
Last time she didn't, and she's like, "Look, it's not worthy of my response." This time, it's very important for the senator in establishing her being a straight line with continuing the tradition of Obama to basically say, look, Tulsi Gabbard doesn't represent any part of the Obama coalition, and to push her further out from that and say that she doesn't really represent those voters that she's trying to appeal to.
It is a bit of a fact check. Tulsi did appear on Fox about 20 times during the Obama presidency. She did have a meeting with Trump at Trump Tower after he was elected and talk about foreign policy in Syria and such like that. So there was an accurate statement by Harris. Now, another fact check is both these candidates are polling 3, 4, 5%. Tulsi much lower than Senator Harris. So neither of them are a major factor at this point. Tulsi much less so. But she's kind of taken on the role of like the official troll of the debates. She's like every debate she's kind of like taking a shot.
Hey,
she took one at Pete. She took one at
Someone leaned
Kamala.
over and said, "Hey, Manchurian candidate." I mean, it was just like really understanding. The thing that's so interesting in a big field is each one of these candidates are trying to figure out their lane. I mean, some of the challenges I feel like Senator Harris has had is trying to establish herself in more of a moderate lane.
Yeah.
That's taken. Buttigieg and Biden and Klobuchar are firmly in that space. And so it just seemed like here she was establishing a new lane, which is that.
Like the center-left lane, but she'd be pulled over for changing lanes so often. She started out in the left, I'm for Medicare for all, and no public health insurance. Then she came back to the center, now she's veering off, and the CHP has got to be following her at this point.
All right, let's move on to impeachment hearings. We had 3 days of hearings this week, heard from 9 witnesses. This is only week 2. Of all the people we heard from this week, who stood out for you? Let's start with you, Amy.
Fiona Hill. Fiona Hill was credible, expert, spoke with authenticity and clarity and called out the Republicans for these kind of the story about the Ukraine that they've been telling. She said, look, that's not true. And I'm going to tell you, as an expert, it's not true. It's a falsehood. And here's the truth about Russia and Russia's meddling in our election. It's not Ukraine. I thought that was very important to establish. Her audience, I feel, was not the Congress members of, it was the American people. Yeah. She's speaking broadly because I think we ought to appreciate the impeachment hearings are a way to publicly discuss these issues. And so I think she had a big impact on public perception of what's going on.
Right. And one of the other explosive moments this week was when Gordon Sondland said that there was a quid pro quo. Joe, how did Republicans treat this?
They kind of took them apart about that. They said, well, there's a quid pro quo on what? Was it on the exchange of money, or was it on the exchange of a meeting? And they kind of narrowed it down to it's on the meeting, and he kind of backed off. It was about the money. He came off kind of like clownish, frankly. He didn't seem, and he's not a professional diplomat. Let's face it, he's a hotelier. He's a rich guy who gave $1 million to Trump's inaugural address, so they gave him the ambassadorship, as those things tend to go. So, I mean, he kind of did harm for both sides. The thing we come out of these week of hearings are one, Trump will be impeached, and two, he will not be removed from office because you didn't get a lot of sense that the Republicans were moving away from him, despite the stuff, the quid pro quo connection that was made. So we're kind of at where we predicted we were going to be at the beginning of the hearings.
And Joe, just quickly, what do you think are some of the key risks for Democrats in the coming weeks or months around the impeachment investigation?
Don't let it drag on too long, because if it drags on, and I don't know how much control they're going to have on this once it gets into the Senate, but if this starts going into, right before, a couple weeks before the Iowa caucuses, then that's going to be the big show, and it's not going to be the showcase for all the candidates. And plus, you have, 5 senators who are going to have to be spending time voting and listening, acting as jurors in the trial. That's going to be tough on them.
I do want to say that if the Democrats had not moved forward with impeachment, then it would have been very demotivating for the base. The Democrats are going to expect to vote. So I think it's important that it's happening. I agree with you about they're being motivated to wrap things up quickly.
Right. Joe Guerra Foley, senior political writer for the San Francisco Chronicle, and Amy Allison, founder and president of She the People. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
On Wednesday, utility giant PG&E began shutting off power in parts of 11 counties in Northern California, including Napa and Sonoma. It's the second consecutive month that PG&E has cut off power to customers to avoid sparking a wildfire with its equipment during dry and windy weather. And on Monday, lawmakers in Sacramento called executives from the state's 3 largest investor-owned utilities, including PG&E, to testify about last month's power outages. At the hearing, PG&E CEO Bill Johnson said the shutoffs are, quote, not a sustainable solution to the threat of wildfires. Joining me now is KQED reporter and editor Dan Brecky. And Dan, let's start off with this week's shutoffs. At the beginning of the week, we heard from PG&E that more than 300,000 customers could lose power. Then a few days later, they pared that down to 150,000 customers. What was going on here?
Well, the weather conditions were changing. So that 300,000 number was when they thought the winds were going to cover a pretty wide area, and they were also expecting humidity to drop to a certain level and to exacerbate the fire danger. As the weather changed, they sort of narrowed that footprint. And when they actually did the shutoffs, they only shut off, I say, because this is a lot of people, 50,000 customers. That could be about 125,000 people or more.
And what areas ended up losing power?
It was everywhere from Sonoma County, sort of northern and eastern Sonoma County, across to the northern Sierra Nevada and the foothills. So it was pretty confined to a smaller area than we've seen in all these earlier shutoffs.
And the weather all clear was called yesterday, right? Are there still folks without power now?
No, just about everybody is back online now. And PG&E is actually saying that they think that we're probably through with the season. There's potential for high winds on Monday. And even so, it doesn't look like it's going to create a fire danger.
And there's rain forecast next week too, right?
Yeah, I should go into that. It hasn't rained in most of the Bay Area or Northern California in many, many months. And next week is supposed to sort of break that dry spell. So we could get an inch or two of rain and a lot of snow in the Sierra Nevada. So maybe we're going to be done with this crazy period of losing our power.
PG&E's been under pressure from state and local officials to do a better job of communicating when and where these safety shutoffs will occur. How did the utility do this time around?
You know, I think they did pretty well. It's a little hard to tell unless you're in one of these areas that's being shut off, because the communication that's happening is a little bit more direct if you're in those areas. The only way to really know for sure if you're going to be turned off or not, and this is really true for the last several events, is if you actually went online and looked up your address. But since as we were saying, this is a moving target, it was a little hard to tell from the outside looking in as a media person exactly where they were going to turn off power and when. That said, their website stayed up, which it didn't do in early October, and I think people would agree generally that they did a little bit better job this time and throughout the later shutoffs in getting the word out.
So communication was also a major focus of Monday's hearing in front of the Senate Energy, Utilities, and Communications Committee in Sacramento. What did PG&E's executives have to say when they were questioned about this?
Well, you talked about what Bill Johnson said about how this is not a sustainable solution, these widespread power outages. And I think one of the things that he is trying to do there is to sort of correct or walk back a statement he made last month that it might take 10 years before we get out of this kind of regime of power outages and fire danger. And I think there's a more nuanced message now that PG&E is committed to really improving its infrastructure so that these power shutoffs can be much more closely targeted. So I think that was the main message. And they're also trying to deal with the widespread outrage that they're hearing from the governor and from legislators and customers and local officials about all the impacts of having the lights turned off on a regular basis.
And we should mention that there were two other investor-owned utilities at the hearing, right. San Diego Gas and Electric and SoCal Edison. Did they have the same kind of grilling from lawmakers that PG&E got?
Well, Southern California Edison does not have a spotless record in terms of starting fires with its electrical infrastructure, so they get a hard time, and they've started fires this year. San Diego Gas and Electric is in a little bit different position. It's got a smaller service territory. It's basically just San Diego County, but that's a lot of customers. But they started working on this whole thing about how do you mitigate wildfire danger when you have this dangerous electricity flowing through the lines and the winds are blowing at 80 miles an hour. They started on that more than 10 years ago. So now they're sort of the darling of the regulators and the legislators because they've worked out much more sophisticated methods for dealing with this. So that's pretty much reflected in the reception they're getting in Sacramento and from the California Public Utilities Commission here in San Francisco.
Is there something that PG&E could learn from SDG&E?
Well, PG&E actually has said many times this year that they're trying to execute some of the same practices that SDG&E has adopted. That's partly because they keep hearing, and we keep hearing, that SDG&E does such a good job. And the record actually does show that since they really started into this program of targeted power shutoffs, preemptive power shutoffs, they have started virtually no large fires.
And just quickly, Dan, what about compensation for wildfire victims? Can you give us an update on that?
Well, it's a bit of a mess still. We don't know. There are competing plans that are before the bankruptcy court here in San Francisco. The state and Governor Newsom are talking about some kind of backup plan that sounds like they might be edging towards some kind of public ownership solution. It's a little unclear. In the meantime, the deadline for people who suffered wildfire losses, who have been victims of wildfires started by PG&E, were just granted an extension until December 31st to file their claims. So a lot is unresolved here as far as victim compensation.
All right, KQED editor and reporter Dan Brecky, thank you.
You're welcome.
Wednesday marked the 50th anniversary of the occupation of Alcatraz Island by Native American students and community leaders. Calling themselves the, quote, Indians of all tribes, the group took over the former prison to push for federal recognition of Native American rights and land claims. The occupation ended when armed federal marshals raided the island 19 months later in June of 1971. Today, a new generation of activists are commemorating the historic takeover and showing why, in the words of one of its leaders, Alcatraz is an idea, not an island. Joining me now is Eloy Martinez, a Native American activist and one of the original community leaders of the occupation. Hi, Eloy.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you. So, Alcatraz Island is, of course, known as the home of the federal prison with infamous prisoners like the mobster Al Capone. I'm wondering, why did you and other indigenous leaders decide to take it over? Why Alcatraz?
Because it was not very dissimilar to reservations, non-sustainable. It's a rock, you couldn't grow anything, there's no game, nothing there, and it was one of those things that we wanted to show everybody and the conditions, how they exist on the reservations. And also, because in the east they have the Statue of Liberty that says welcome and all that, we wanted something similar close to the Golden Gate that said, coming in, you could see, all the ships could see you coming in and say you are on Indian land.
Can you describe what life was like there during those early months?
It was cold, the winter, we went in December. Actually, it wasn't supposed to happen until like the spring of 1970. But the Indian Center burned down, and
the Indian Center in San Francisco.
And then the island had been sold to the Hunt brothers by the city of San Francisco, and they were in the process of going to turn it into a Monte Carlo of the West. So we decided that we had to really make a move quick, so that's why they pushed it up. And also some of the elder leaders that weren't involved in the shooter, operations, they wanted to take over, so they had gone to an Indian conference back in, I think, Minnesota, and the students decided, well, while they're gone, we're going to take over the island so that they couldn't claim that they were, part of that. So that was, there was a lot of stuff that went on, but it was pretty exciting. The adrenaline was really high. People were glad to be free. There was no oversight on you, and the kids were running all over and discovering things. It was also scary. Because at that time you have to remember all what was going on, the Black Panthers and SLA and all those things, all that Foster, all that stuff was going on at that time, and people were getting killed. Some of the leaders, some of our leaders got killed. I think actually Richard Oakes got killed. I think he was set up also. But that was all part of that whole system to target the individual leaders that were strong, and he was a strong leader at that time. So, but.
Do you have a fond memory of being on Alcatraz?
I have a lot of fond memories out there because it was pretty awesome. You had a lot of just watching the kids play, and and plus it was probably one of the biggest gatherings we'd had since it was never there was original 14 on the first attempt, and there was 93 that came back out on the 20th. And then, like that first on Thanksgiving Day, there was close to 400 people out there, and it kept increasing. So I think over the course of the time, probably 30,000 people went through the island at least, and that was not really it was kind of hard to do because they didn't after they took the water barge away and they didn't have any water. So when people went out on the island, they asked them to bring food and water with them as getting on the island. Some of the people that actually came on the island that didn't have money to pay the $3 fare that the guys were charging to take them out there, they actually gave up their own jewelry and and stuff that they had, regalia and stuff. And I think one of the guy that owned the bathtub too, has a lot of that stuff that they gave him. He actually brought it out to the first Indian tribes occupation show-off in 2016 and showed it off.
How would you say this takeover 50 years ago still reverberates today, whether it's protests over building pipelines on native lands or other protests?
Well, I think it's necessary. Standing Rock, a lot of people don't talk about it. Standing Rock was kind of like a really bad place to be. I went down there actually 3 times. A lot of people went down there. And they had, before we got there, they had sprayed racine poison was it groundhog poison, for killing groundhogs, I guess. But they sprayed that poison. We all camped out. We were sleeping on top of that, and then they soaked it down. So a lot of people came back sick. And then if you saw any of the footage, the way they treated the people down there with the dogs and the fire hoses and all that other stuff that they did to people, times haven't really changed that much. What was really good to see, was all the young people that were there. They were fearless. And that's just like Alcatraz was back in the day. So, and these young people right now, they're all over the place. Julian, Isabella, Zizi, all these young people, they're out there in the forefront. They're doing their thing,
And one of the original organizers of the occupation, Richard Oakes, described Alcatraz as an idea rather than a physical space. Is that something that you agree with, and what does that mean to you?
I agree with it, and it means that the idea is just spreading out there. People are still going out. A lot of people that were on Alcatraz left Alcatraz and went on, to do other things. Dr. Lenata Warjak, she got her degree, and a lot of the students did the same. Wilma Mankiller left out of there and went back to her tribe and told the city, and give us a pipe, we'll bring our own water in, and now their tribe is doing really well. Almost everybody that was out there, Shasheen Littlefeather came out of that same movement with Marlon Brando, and all those people. That idea was to make the Native Americans visible, and we've actually are accomplishing that right now, because right now there's probably at least 300 people in the Bay Area that were out there on that island. There's a whole bunch of originals here that'll be here until tomorrow. They're going to have a big kind of a where did you go, what did you do kind of a thing, because some of us haven't seen each other in 50 years.
A reunion of sorts.
It is, because 50 years ago when we left Alcatraz and all that, the people, everybody would always say, well, you guys didn't accomplish much, but we accomplished a whole lot. It's all visible now. Termination was ended. A lot of tribes got their property back. A lot of they got their lakes back. So it's, now you have people that have a way to get an education which you didn't have before, because now they have the means for it. And that's what that idea is about.
Eloy Martinez, thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
And that'll do it for us. As always, you can find more of our coverage at kqed.org/newsroom. I'm Tiffany Kamhai. Thanks for joining us.